Thank you very much. You can hear me well, can you? Yes, brilliant. So thank you for staying on for this talk. And as you've just heard, I'm an applied linguist. I'm interested in learning second languages. And I know some of you are applied linguists here, but if you're not, I also know many of you are second language learners or speakers or users. So hopefully, if this is not your area of expertise, you'll still find some of the things I'll be talking about interesting. So how does our mind and brain work when we speak or write in a second language? This is the question I try to answer you to some extent today. I'm myself a second language speaker and user. My first language is Hungarian, and like many of you, I started learning languages later in adulthood. So why is it important to learn second languages? I know you don't need to be complex with globalization. There is an increased interest in using second languages. It's key to achieve academic, occupational, and social communication goals for many. But little is known about the neuro-cognitive processes involved second language speaking and writing. But why is it important? Why is it important to look at the actual processes in which we engage when we speak or write in a second language? Well, it's important for theory building. When we speak or write in a second language, maybe you can think about yourself as well when you do this. First, we need to conceptualize what we say or what we would like to write. We have to think about what we would like to say. Then once we know what we would like to convey, we need to rely on linguistic encoding processes. We need to think about the vocabulary, the syntax that we'll be able to use when we formulate our message. Then, once we've done that, we also move on to using our motor movements. We might start to write, we might start to articulate our message in the second language. While we are doing this, we are constantly monitoring what we are doing. We think about, is it what we are saying, what we intended to say? Is it what we've written? Is what we wanted to write? And all of these processes are happening in parallel. We really, we work as the way I see it, a bit like a computer, while we are conceptualizing, encoding, and using articulation or handwriting. We're all doing this at the same time. When assessing theoretical models of second language production, which I've just introduced in very, very broad terms, it's really important to do this because if we only look at just the linguistic products, for example, what the product of writing is or what the product our speaking is, we really can't test these models. We need to look at neurocognitive processes as well. Otherwise, we might fall into a trap what is referred to in more assessment circle as construct underrepresentation. Just to give you an example, when, for example, you write, sometimes you pause. I'm sure you do that, right? We all do. And depending on where you pause, or, and the purpose of your pausing might differ. You might pause because you're thinking about what you'd like to write. But it's also possible because you pause, you're thinking of how to write those things, to use the best vocabulary, the best syntax. But if we only look at the pause, we wouldn't know that. We really have to figure out what those underlying processes are. Know what processes second language users and learners engage in, it can also generate useful insights for second language instruction. For example, we can diagnose sources of difficulty for second language users. Again, just getting back to pausing, a learner who is struggling with what to say needs very different instruction from someone who is looking for the appropriate grammar or vocabulary. But if we want to help these learners, we need to understand what they're struggling with. So given the importance of investigating second language processes, some of the key questions are from a methodological perspective. How can we investigate these processes? What tools second language researchers have to look into neurocognitive processes? And in the rest, of 25 minutes or so, I give you an introduction. What are the tools we're using to look at neurocognitive processes in the field of second language learning? We can use subjective measures. Probably you're all familiar with these, especially questionnaires and interviews. And another method that I talk about is the stimulated recall interview. When it comes to questionnaires and interviews, you're all familiar with these methods. They are relatively easy to administer, but the problem with them is if we ask somebody what they were thinking, what they were speaking or writing in a second language, they might not remember exactly what they engaged in. So there is a problem or danger of memory decay. Stimulated recall can deal with some of these issues. What does it involve? This is an offline procedure that is aimed to tap participants or learners' thought processes while they engage in a session after they produce the second language. Usually some sort of tangible reminder is used. It could be a recording, a video recording, or keystroke recording of what they did. And then what we normally do, we ask them to tell us what they were thinking, why they were completing a second language activity. Just to give you an example, in this study, Kim et al., participants engaged in a more difficult and a less difficult second language task. And after they completed this task, the researcher replayed a recording of that activity, and learners could stop that recording and they could tell what they were thinking after task performance. And also the researchers stopped the recording as well to ask participants why they experienced certain difficulty. What about this methodology? Again, there is a bit of an issue with memory decay. And also, what if these participants are not reporting what they were actually thinking? That could be an issue with veridicality. So it's a subjective method, but it's useful in the sense that we have some sort of tangible reminder of the event. Given the limitation of subjective measures such as stimulated recall methodology, interviews, and questionnaires, researchers have also started using more objective measures to look at second language performance. One of them is referred to as dual task methodology. What does dual task methodology involve? When we engage in this technology, normally there is a secondary task which is concurrently used with the primary task we are involved in. Secondary tasks may include simple activities which require sustained attention. For example, participants might need to detect a simple visual stimulus, just like this. It has just the color of my computer screen has changed. They might also hear some sort of auditory stimulus, like beep, while they're speaking or writing. And the assumption is, when the primary task is more difficult, then we would expect the secondary task performance is going to be harder. So the accuracy on that task is going to decrease, and also we are going to become slower. So in that way, we can get some window into the cognitive processes, the difficulty that second language learners experience. Or the other way around, when participants do better on a secondary task, they get faster, they get more accurate. Maybe the task, the language speaking task, or any task, it would apply to other cognitive activities as well, is getting easier. Let me just show you an example of a study I did on oral production when we used this methodology. We were comparing simple and complex versions of a second language task. Whenever participants saw a change in the background, the background of the screen, they had to react to color changes. If the computer backgrounds changed to red, then they were not supposed to react, but when it was green, they had to react. So imagine you're speaking in your second language, which might be hard for, especially if you're a lower proficiency speaker, and the background is changing like this. So you're not reacting now, but now you're reacting. So you're doing two things at the same time. And depending how well you're reacting, aligned with the instruction is going to give some window into the cognitive processes you're engaging in. Okay, so what about this measure? It's quite a useful measure in the sense it's an online measure. It's happening while we're speaking or while we're writing. So there is no issue with memory decay. But it is obtrusive, right? When you're speaking or writing and you have to do a second activity at the same time, it's likely to interfere with your actual cognitive processes. Let me show you another method that we can use when we actually study writing behaviors. This is keystroke logging. What keystroke logging does, when we write, it registers all the keystrokes and mouse movements that we produce while we're writing. Then the log data can be used for looking at our fluency, pausing, and revision behaviors. I know this looks quite scary, but basically this is the type of output you're getting, okay? This comes from an input logging software, keystroke logging software called input log. So let me show you what it does. It records what you've written, okay? What you revise, basically everything. It also shows where you pause. You can reflect on your own writing processes. So it will show you that this point, this writer paused between history and end, and the pause was 7,348 milliseconds, basically around 7 seconds. It also shows what has been deleted, okay? This person basically deleted almost everything they've written, okay? Is it familiar? It is familiar to me. Okay, fortunately, this type of software can also generate some more, automatic output, so we can get some automatic indices, fluency, speeding behaviors, and revision behaviors. Okay, what we did with this technology in one of my studies, again, we looked at more and less difficult tasks, and then we saw how task complexity, whether a participant had some support with content or not, influenced their speed fluency, how fast they wrote, how often they paused, and also what they revised. And we did find it very helpful, and we did get all those automatic indices. What about keystroke logging? Is this a useful technique? Well, it's online, right? It's recording while we're writing. It's unobtrusive. We can just engage in our normal writing processes. But we still don't know if somebody is writing, we don't know where they're looking on the screen, which is also important. Imagine when you write, you go up on the screen, you go down. If we really want to have a full picture, we would also like to know where people are looking. Also, we want to know what they're thinking. But let's focus on looking now. Another way to look at neurocognitive processes when it comes to writing or any kind of activity, when we engage with a computer scheme or computer-mediated context, we can use eye tracking. So what does eye tracking do? It records the moment-by-moment eye fixations of an individual while they interact with a visual stimulus. So it records where we are looking on a particular screen. All those circles show eye fixations. It also shows in what sequence we're looking on the screen. Okay, so here you see first, second, third, fourth. These are our eye gazes. And there are these little jumps between those eye gazes. Those are referred to as saccades. And it also tells us how long our fixations are, where we look longer on a computer screen. Let me show you an example of this. This comes from a writing study. Look, someone is writing, and you can see those red dots. Those are these participants' eye movements. So the person is going back in the text, looking over, reading what they wrote before. So this is a pause, right? If we didn't have this information, we would have no idea what the person was doing. And through this, we can see or get some insight into their reading processes through writing. I'm going to go to the next slide. How do I do that? Yes, just like that. So the underlying assumption when it comes to eye tracking is that the way the screen, where our attention is on the screen, is going to reflect where our attention is at that moment. Visual attention, of course, we don't know about other aspects, but it's also one piece of the puzzle. I'm going to show you one more study where we used task complexity when it comes to second language learning, how learners allocated their attention during a second language learning task. We designed 2 tasks. One of them was supposed to be more complex, more demanding for second language learners, and the other one more simple. And we saw that this is going to be reflected in their eye movements. We used 2 types of measures. When you use eye tracking, researchers normally look at the number of eye fixations, how many times people look at a certain area of the screen, and also the duration of these fixations, how long these fixations are on a certain area of interest. As you can see on the top picture there are fewer fixations than in the bottom picture. In terms of durations, they seem quite similar. All those little circles seem to be of the same size. Okay, so what did we do? Our participants, our second language learners, read a short illustrated biographical story. One of the stories was about Eleanor Roosevelt, and they had to reason about possible causes of life events. For example, they saw something like this. Eleanor called for laws about equality in the US, but they had to form a sentence like this. If she hadn't seen unfair treatment, then she wouldn't have called for laws to be changed. But here the participants had to decide which option to go with, whether to go with unfair treatment or traveling. She did both of these, and based on the text they've read before, they should be able to make this decision. And this was the correct solution. Our simple version, the decision here between the 2 options was relatively simple. We designed it to be simple. I think even if you hadn't read the story, probably you could figure out which is the more likely outcome. When it comes to the more complex version, there was a more difficult decision to make. Both of these seem quite plausible, I hope. So we hypothesized that this would be reflected in participants' eye movements under the simple version, probably in this area of interest, they would spend less time. And when it comes to the complex version, when you would expect that probably they take a little bit longer to make that decision. So what did we find? Indeed, we did find that under the complex version, in that area that you see the dotted lines, participants fixated there longer and also more times. And now I'm going to test you soon, so pay attention, okay? Hopefully you did, because otherwise you won't be able to answer my question. So when it comes to visual representations of eye tracking, this is something referred to as a heat map. And when it's greener, that shows that participants look in that area less frequently. They spend less time on those areas. If it's redder, they spend more attention on those areas. So my question is, can you figure out which one is the complex condition in this study and which one was the simple condition? Just take a moment to think about this. So the red means they spend more time in that area. If you were my students, I would ask you to raise your hand when you've made up your mind. So maybe I won't ask to do that, but probably you had a bit of time to think about this. Any volunteer who is brave enough to tell me which one is which, the more complex, more demanding? The left one is the right? Okay, maybe not. Why would that be, right? If it's under the simple condition, probably they made that decision faster, right? And if they made that decision faster, they started focusing on this picture earlier. So if you have to make a more complex decision, probably you go up and down, right? You think a little bit more about this. So in a way, this sort of, eye gaze movements did borne out our predictions. Okay, just one more picture here. This is a gaze plot. Here we can see more detailed information. Again, under the simple condition, you can see hardly clear decision made fast. And when it comes to the more complex condition, both pictures received quite a few eye fixations. Okay, so what about this methodology? Not online. It is online because you're getting data at the same time participants are completing a task. It's a bit obtrusive, not too much, because you're using an eye tracker, but nowadays you have mobile eye trackers, so they don't interfere much, but they still don't know what participants are thinking, which is an issue. Okay, there's just one more thing I wanted to talk to you about, which is really exciting. I think I just started working on this with neuroscientists. I'm not a neuroscientist, but I'm collaborating with some. We're trying to see how neuroscience measures can help us looking at neurocognitive processes. And what we use is a technique called functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI. I'm sure you came across this before, but maybe not in the context of language learning. So what does this technique do? It takes picture of slices of our brain, and the brightness of that image shows how active the neural activity was when we engaged in a certain activity and which part of the brain was activated. So how does this work? Neurons are apparently like muscles. So when part of the brain is turned on, these neurons start firing there. And if they start firing there, they need more blood. And what fMRI does, again, I'm telling you what I learned from these neuroscientists, don't ask me more, it picks up these movements. So I'm a runner, maybe if you do physical activity, you have this experience that when you start moving faster, your muscles need a lot more, energy, and that's probably would also show up in an fMRI machine. Okay, so fMRI basically detects small changes in blood flow that occur with brain activity. Yes, I've tried this. It's me going into the fMRI machine a few years ago at Tohoku University when I started working with these colleagues from Japan. I'm not sure whether you've been in a machine before. It's not ecologically valid. You don't feel comfortable, but you still get some really exciting data. And yes, that's my brain. So can we use fMRI to investigate second language production processes? Well, previous L2 researchers have used this technique, but usually for really controlled activities. You would listen to a sentence and you would really look at a tiny, tiny piece of difference between two sentences, which might be different. But what we try to do is really use this technique for spontaneous written and oral production. So what we are doing at the moment in an ongoing project with these colleagues from Tohoku University, some colleagues from UCL, and also from Waseda University, we are trying to see whether, again, pausing, I'm interested in pausing, whether where we pause when we write and when we speak is going to generate different type of brain activity. So if you think about your own writing, again, your second language writer, maybe you can think about whether when you pause between your clauses, what you're thinking about, and when you pause within a clause. So if you're not a linguist, you might not know what a clause is. So let me give you an example. So in this case, if I were in the thinking boat, this is a larger textual unit, there is a pause. I will choose knife, lighter. It comes from our data. There is another pause. And here there's a different type of clause. This happened between a smaller texture unit. If I were in the thinking boat, I will choose knife, lighter. So we had a pause between knife. When it comes to enclosed pauses, the idea is we all do this in our first language as well. We tend to think about what we would like to say or write. But when it comes to second language learners, they more often pause mid-clause as compared to first language learners, because mid-clause pauses tend to relate to linguistic encoding processes more. Grammar, vocabulary, how you're going to use the language. So if this is true, and from behavioral evidence we think it's true, we would expect different type of brain activity. And this is something we wanted to test in our study. So what did our participants do? They did 8 monologic speaking tasks in an fMRI scanner. These were all disaster-related tasks. This was the topic, the funding area where we got our resources for. Just to give you an example, they were told they are a firefighter, they caught a fire in a tall building, they arrive with a helicopter, but they can't save everybody, and they have to make a decision who to take from these 8 people. And what they have to do, they have to tell us why you choose or you didn't choose each person. While they were doing this, again, they were in the scanner. We had a 3T MRI, Philips Achieva scanner. We also used a noise cancelling microphone. I'm not sure if you were in a machine like this, you know, it's quite noisy. So if you don't have this type of microphone, it's difficult to listen to yourself and also to analyze the data later. And then the repetition of scan time was every 2 seconds. So what did we find? Actually, in mid-clause pauses, as we expected, there was greater brain activation in areas which were sensitive to linguistic difficulty. Some of these areas are the left inferior frontal gyrus, which has been associated with syntactic processing, thinking about word order, retrieving lexical items, using the right vocabulary before, and also the basal ganglia, which is related to syntactic processing. So we did find, indeed, this brain imaging data showed mid-clause pauses, as we expected, was related to language-related processing to a greater extent. We also find when it comes to end-clause pauses, there was greater activation in an area of the brain which is called precuneus, which is a theory of mind area, which went very well together with our idea that maybe it relates more to conceptualization, to the message that we are trying to say. Theory of mind network, I'm not sure whether you're familiar with this concept, but basically it underlines humans' ability to understand each other's beliefs, desires, and intentions. So we thought that in our task, when participants had to make a decision who to take or not, they were not in that situation, so you had to infer what others would do. So probably that theory of mind network did play a role. So we thought this was, nicely went together with our assumption. Okay, so fMRI, what are those pros and cons? A direct advantage, it really shows what's happening in our brain. It provides direct insight into brain activity. Is it ecologically valid? Is that people do in real life being an fMRI machine? Clearly not. And for now, this is very expensive. We were really lucky to be able to do this research with colleagues in Japan, but it's not feasible in every context. Okay, so I went through in a really brief journey through various methods that can be used to look at neuro-cognitive processes in second language learning, but I've always pointed the advantages and disadvantages. And of course, if you would like to do a nice study, we would want to combine these techniques so we get a fuller picture and a more valid picture of these processes. So some R2 studies, and in other areas, of course, it's the same thing. Triangulation is gaining more and more ground, have exactly done this. And finally, before I just finish this talk, I wanted to show you how we did this in one of our studies on writing. Again, we're still interested in pauses, whether we pause mid-clause or end-clause, it's related to different type of cognitive processes. So we use 3 types of techniques: stimulated recall methodology, keystroke logging, and eye tracking. Remember keystroke logging, right? We have all that data. So when it comes to clauses, we know where they occur, how long they are, through the keystroke logging methodology. But if we only use keystroke logging, we still don't know where participants are looking, okay? So to get some ideas about looking behaviors, which also tell us where participants are reading, we also used eye tracking. So here's one more example. I showed this someone for you before, but again, here, for example, we can see that the participant was looking at the previous sentence when they paused. So we know that probably it wasn't, going back in the paragraph. It was relatively local, but not as local as just looking at the phrase before. Just one more example here. Oops, no, this one, you've just seen this. Let me go to the next one. Here the participant goes back in the previous paragraph during pausing, really reading back. Remember, those circles are the eye movements. Okay, so now we know what participants typed. We also know where they were looking, but we still don't know what they're thinking. And here comes the stimulated recall process, which actually told us what they were thinking. And then what we did towards the end, just an example here, I was thinking what examples I was going to write, what point should I make, okay? So we're getting an insight into participants' thought processes. So through triangulating these 3 sources, we really get a more valid picture, a bigger, more pieces of the puzzle came together. And just before I finish, I just wanted to share with you what would be my dream study, okay? I have this type of dreams, other people might have different ones. We did this for writing already, but what I'd love to do in the future, and hopefully we'll be able to do it soon, not sure just yet, we also use neuroimaging with all of these techniques, and then we can have like really a full picture of what people do when they write and when they pause. And I think I'm going to stop here, and thank you very much for your attention.
So, Andrea, you have about 15 minutes for any questions.
Yes, of course.
Thank you. What do you think the results would be when you compare the age at which the second language is learnt? And how many languages can an individual be tested on this? Is the third language going to be a deeper delay? A fourth language, a fifth language?
That's a really good empirical question, which I don't think has been done, but I can speculate. This is, maybe I should say that especially when it comes to the neuroimaging research, hardly anything on spontaneous production just yet. So we are sort of, among the first people to do this. But when it comes to your second languages, we know it from bilingual research. Even if you're bilingual and you learn 2 languages from birth, you're going to be slower when it comes to lexical access, for example, accessing vocabulary. So we would expect even then some sort of delay. And the later you learn your second languages, life is not fair. Unfortunately, listen to me, I have my accent. Probably many of you have the same experience. We are likely to have, some sort of, I wouldn't say disadvantage because we're very good at our first languages, right? But it's going to be different. I would expect more mid-clause pauses, for example.
Very quickly, if one parent speaks one language and the other parent speaks a different language, what happens then?
Yes, again, I'm going to, this, I would say this is not my research area, but I have colleagues who do work on bilingualism and multilingualism. So I'm happy to share, but, I'm not, I should say I'm not really, the go-to person when it comes to this. I bring up my children bilingually. My husband is Hungarian as well. So we both speak Hungarian at home. So it's relatively easy. But when you have 2 people and the different languages, it becomes a little bit harder, right? It's just a question of input. Input is really important when it comes to learning second languages or growing up bilingually. And there is less input, and inevitably there will be less input. You have to work harder. Some studies shows if you really like to have simultaneous bilinguals who can go for, as a native speaker in both of those languages, at least 60% of the, or no, 40% of the input has to be in that language. So even in the less often used language, you would expect 40%, which is huge, right? So yeah, input is key. And you can do it in your third and fourth, but of course, if it's third and fourth, the input is becoming even less. You're welcome. Yes.
I'm just wondering about, the three. I'm just wondering about, the three, kind of tools: the stimulator recall, the keystroke, logging, and also the eye tracking, as applied to the speaking part, for that. So how is the I can understand the stimulated recall about like the decision they make, about that one. But what about the eye tracking part? Was it about like the prompts that they're focusing on? But if it is the prompts they're focusing on, it could be related to some interest part, because I previously did a study in humor, which is looking at how people process humor, in the past.
Yes.
And I came across, eye tracking technique, from, I think, from Germany at that time here. So the question is probably the persons engaged in the prompts, that part may not be related to what we're looking at. It just may be recalling their past experience, or maybe, oh, this is Snoopy, but no, it's Pikachu. So they spend more, kind of time because it didn't follow the expectation, which was Snoopy.
Yes, it's a really good point. And when it comes to eye tracking, and especially speaking, keystroke logging we can't use with speaking, right? Because it's really about typing. When it comes to eye tracking, it's only applicable. Maybe I shouldn't say only, I mentioned that later, why not? But normally we use it when there is some sort of screen, some sort of visual stimuli. And you're right, people might be, distracted by visual information. Sometimes people just gazing on the screen. So we can't always make this direct connection. But that's why I think triangulation is really important, right? You can't just rely on one source, because then you might be misled. But studies overall show it not 100% of the time, but often we do get useful information from eye tracking. Another thing that's emerging from the literature, if you gaze somewhere longer, it can also actually indicate difficulty, right? Sometimes people associate that with more learning, but it could be actually difficulty, not necessarily learning. So that's why, again, interpretation is just really visual attention that you're measuring. I totally agree. You asked me about eye tracking. It can also be used. There are some studies which actually look at interaction when they follow people's eye movements, whether they're looking at the interlocutor or not. So that's another way, mutual attention, where this technique can be used in the context of speaking. Thank you for the question.
We have a question online from Lynn Allen, who asks, do the neuro-cognitive processes involved in second language production share a similarity with the cerebral processes involved in learning a new skill or subject in one's first language?
Okay. I should mention again, I'm not really a neuroscientist, but let me try to answer this question from more of a behavioral perspective. When it comes to second language learning, a lot of researchers think of learning a second language as being a skill. Not everyone agrees with that, because some would assume that we have a special language acquisition device. If you've heard of Chomsky, he would be one of these people. But I'm not one of his fans. I think I'm more of a cognitively oriented researcher. So I do believe the skill acquisition theory would also apply to learning a second language. And skill acquisition theory is very general. It's about learning any skill. So if you learn to type, if you learn to ride a bicycle, if you learn a language, there are many similarities. Of course, not everything, but first you probably establish declarative knowledge, knowing what to do, and then you practice. Practice is really important for any sort of skill that you learn. That's why input is so important, because unless we use the language, we get exposed to more and more language, we won't be able to learn. So in that sort of general language learning or general learning process, I think there are many similarities. I think there is a question over there.
Hi, thanks for the information you're giving about this neuro-cognitive. My name is Hisham Qadar. I'm at Texas A&M University in Qatar, teaching very simple chemistry. I want to ask you a very simple question. When you think to tackle the problem, do you think in your language or the second language? As your language,
Like, are you asking?
yeah, that's what I'm asking.
When counting, that's interesting. Someone said counting. I definitely count in my first language, for sure. Because I studied, I was a relatively late starter. I was 15 when I started learning English. So I studied mathematics and everything.
Yeah, this one.
Yeah. But when it comes to linguistics, I definitely think in, or, I don't even know the terminology in Hungarian as much.
Yeah, because I know from my kids, because when they're studying English at the beginning, they think in English, not in Arabic or other languages. But in my case, no, I think in Arabic, the first language, then translate to the second language, English or French, whatever.
Yeah, I'm not, the more proficient you become, the less of that translation you do, right? And I know you had Live earlier who gave sort of opening here. He's someone who done a lot of research into translanguaging. I'm not sure whether he talked about that, but it's when you go through one language to the other. And those of us who are multilingual speakers, I'm sure you do this. You speak in one of your language and you might say another word in the other language and use this sort of code switching. Probably this is something happening in your household as well. So what language you're thinking in? Probably it's a mixture. Depends also who you are with, right? If we go back to Hungary, let's say my children switch to Hungarian because many people around them are not bilingual. The English is not useful. But if there are people around you who are familiar with your two languages, then you tend to do that.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think, yeah.
Thank you for this interesting presentation. I'm wondering whether you would expect to see similar outcomes if you were to compare somebody studying different disciplines, for example, science or English or French or maths. Would that there would be consistency in the outcome?
That's an interesting question. I'm just going to speculate here. Again, we haven't done this type of research. You mean that the participants would be studying different disciplines? I would assume that depending on what you study, probably it has to do with your, cognitive abilities. So I would assume maybe if you're more science oriented, maybe you have more stronger verbal analytical skills. And we have some research suggesting those who have these strong verbal analytical skills, they tend to enjoy grammar more. They tend to be better in terms of, more conscious language learning skills. Others might be better, more implicit learning skills. But how these relate to different subjects might vary. But I would assume that depending on more like where your language aptitudes are, could have an influence here, whether you rely more on your metalinguistic skills, your verbal analytical skills or not. Definitely individual differences. Actually, for one of the study we're doing, we have a large battery of working memory measures, which is an important predictor of language learning and also language learning aptitude. Language, basically talent for learning languages, which is not the same as intelligence. Language learning aptitude, we have a lot of evidence suggesting it's a different construct.
There's another one online here. We have from Małgorzata Supicia Pudzanowska. I'm sure I haven't pronounced that correctly. Do you use both late and early eye tracking measures? ? Have you ever thought of doing a pupillometry study to look into a cognitive load related to processing, whether during speaking or writing?
We've got an eye tracking expert here. Thank you for the question. In the study in the particular study I talked about in the writing and the study, we only used late eye tracking measures. These are measures more looking at all the fixation durations or looking at regressions going back. But in some other research of mine, we do look at early measures as well, depending on the research questions. And the other question was pupillometry. I haven't done that, but I'd love to do it. And for this type of research, that's where the question comes from, especially when it comes to simpler or more complex tasks. cognitive load is something that we are tapping, and we would expect that pupillometry would be a useful tool for that, but we haven't done it yet, but we have the equipment, and it did come up in our discussions, and thank you for that question. I agree, I think, with what you're implying.
We have a person in the back.
Mm.
Over there.
Thank you again for this nice presentation.
Mm.
Thinking about the inclusive education, because I'm university teaching, I'm geologist, but I'm very interested in inclusive education. How can this apply to people or students with the sensorial or physical disabilities to break the communication barriers? Thank you.
Really interesting. Again, I keep saying I'm not an expert, but it's interesting to think about this. I think the first thing I would say, it's just to do studies, just looking at the processes of students, individuals with this sort of disabilities or any issues that might, it's very helpful, right? Because we get to see where they struggle, where they might need help with. Because if we just look at the products in terms of second language learning, their text or looking at how they speak, it wouldn't give that insight to us. Actually, a colleague of mine, her name is Judith Kormos at Lancaster University, that's her area, and she's just going to do an eye tracking study with these persons, dyslexic language learners, how they would engage with text, and to see what the implications might be, for example, for doing an IELTS test or on this type of activity. In terms of just one example for how you could use this sort of technology with people with disabilities, eye tracking. I haven't talked about that, but it has, for example, a function of which is referred to gaze contingency paradigm. So eye tracking does not only capture where you're looking on the screen, but it can also react to your eye movements. So for example, people who can't move, can't use their hands, or, then maybe your eye movements could be a way to access information. So that could be one type of application, maybe. I'm just brainstorming here, but it's a really good question and important to look into that more. Thank you. Yes, I think the last question. The lady in the middle.
Hi, thank you for the very interesting presentations. I'm Nurul from Malaysia. I'm a lecturer right now, communication lecturer. I just have a concern about my students basically because I'm teaching communication, mass communications, and I use English as a delivery language during the lecture. But then when it comes to assessment, especially presentations, my student asked me, requests from me that can they use their main language, which is Malay in Malaysia, instead of English during the presentations. So I was like, because the delivery language is English. So I'm very concerned about the ability, the understanding, and also why they request or reject to present in English. So I'm really concerned about that particular student-centered learning. All right. So what is your opinion on that? Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's going to be an opinion, okay? Not an informed opinion. Yeah, maybe I can just relate it from our own context. We also have a lot of international students, and they, when they arrive here in the UK, they might struggle with content. All of a sudden they have to read really complicated, difficult research articles, and we often tell them that maybe you can read it first in your first language. Many of these, pieces are available in their first language, and once you're familiar with the content, then you can move on to, reading the same thing in English. So you first get the meaning, and then your cognitive load getting back to it is decreased. So maybe when you get to, reading it the second time, you also pick up the language. It sounds like they do struggle with it. I think if I were you, probably I would try to figure out, is it also at the understanding level? Because it's one thing to produce, but first you need to have the input to understand that. And then when it comes to production, maybe if they ask for it, I mean, probably I would try to make it gradual and make them more and more comfortable, maybe a little bit in English to begin with, and hopefully they become more and more confident. I'm also very much into task-based language teaching, which is really you do learn by doing. So you plan, and I would try to give them some support how to present in English and increase the complexity of the task as they move along. I know it's very easy to say. It's a long process. Good luck with that. No, I meant in a good way. Yeah.